Thank you, everybody, for coming, first of all. This is amazing. We're super excited that we could host Kate DiCamillo. We need to thank Prairie Lights, because without them, this event probably wouldn't happen. And really, if you have to buy a book, you should always buy it from Prairie Lights. I don't really need to introduce Kate DiCamillo, but I will. She's a very lovely person. She's written some books that you may have heard of, Because of Winn-Dixie, and The Tale of Despero, Bink and Golly, Mercy Watson. We could go on, but I know you're here to hear her, so I am going to give her the mic, and let's give her a big welcome.
How are y'all doing? Wow. I thought that I'd read to you, but what I like to do is talk with y'all. So how many people think that they have questions? Okay, one person, that's great. Okay, so that should keep us busy for a while. How many teachers are here? And how many of you teachers read out loud to your classes? It matters so much. I think about myself. I was a kid who grew up in a house filled with books, a mother who took me to the library twice a week, who bought me books, and I thought that I would die without Mrs. Boyette reading aloud from Island of the Blue Dolphins every day after lunch. And I never thought to thank her. So I'm thanking y'all instead. It matters a lot what you're doing. Okay, so does anybody have a book that I can borrow to read from? Well, you've got a collection there. She wants me to read from Edward Tulane. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it was your mom's book. I'm honored to read from it. So how many of y'all have read Edward Tulane? Wow, okay. I haven't read aloud from this for a long time. One time when you go out and you tour for a book, you almost always read from the beginning. And towards the end of the tour, I was in this huge church, and a little girl stood up and said, I don't want you to read, I want you to read your favorite part of the book. And so my favorite part of the book is the end, and they had all read it, so I thought it would be okay to read that. And it wasn't okay because I lost it in front of all of these people. I could not keep it together. So I'll try not, I don't think I'm going to cry at the beginning, but we'll see. As a kid, I literally can say that I would not, I understood everything through story and through reading, and that's the same way I am as an adult. But now, that reading, that same feeling of being able to understand the world, make sense out of it, make shape and pattern, also comes in with writing the stories. So then my whole experience gets. Kids always ask, is it autobiographical? Is it about you? And the answer is always no, but it's also yes, too, because every one of my experiences gets filtered through those stories, and that shape and pattern comes out, and it helps make sense out of the world. So reading helps me make sense out of the world. Writing helps me make sense out of the world, and I would be lost without both of them. Also, the thing is, so often when I talk with young readers and also older readers, there's so many people who are interested in writing and want writing advice. And when you read voraciously, you absorb the narrative arc. There's a part of you that just becomes a part of you. So in order to, all that reading that I did and that I do helps me write, because it gives me that pattern for how to tell a story.
Once in a house on Egypt Street, there lived a rabbit who was made almost entirely of china. He had china arms and china legs, china paws and a china head, a china torso and a china nose. His arms and legs were jointed and joined by wire so that his china elbows and china knees could be bent, giving him much freedom of movement. His ears were made of real rabbit fur, and beneath the fur there were strong, bendable wires which allowed the ears to be arranged into poses that reflected the rabbit's mood: jaunty, tired, full of ennui. His tail, too, was made of real rabbit fur and was fluffy and soft and well-shaped. The rabbit's name was Edward Tulane, and he was tall. He measured almost 3 feet from the tip of his ears to the tip of his feet. His eyes were painted a penetrating and intelligent blue. In all, Edward Tulane felt himself to be an exceptional specimen. Only his whiskers gave him pause. They were long and elegant, as they should be, but they were of uncertain origin. Edward felt quite strongly that they were not the whiskers of a rabbit. Whom the whiskers had belonged to initially, what unsavory animal, was a question that Edward could not bear to consider for too long, and so he did not. He preferred, as a rule, not to think unpleasant thoughts. Edward's mistress was a 10-year-old dark-haired girl named Abilene Tulane, who thought almost as highly of Edward as Edward thought of himself. Each morning after she dressed herself for school, Abilene dressed Edward. The china rabbit was in possession of an extraordinary wardrobe composed of handmade silk suits, custom shoes fashioned from the finest leather and designed specifically for his rabbit feet, and a wide array of hats equipped with holes so that they could easily fit over Edward's large and expressive ears. Each pair of well-cut pants had a small pocket for Edward's gold pocket watch. Abilene wound this watch for him each morning. "Now, Edward," she said to him after she was done winding the watch, "when the big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3, I will come home to you." She placed Edward on a chair in the dining room and positioned the chair so that Edward was looking out the window and could see the path that led up to the Tulane front door. Abilene balanced the watch on his left leg. She kissed the tips of his ears, and then she left, and Edward spent the day staring out at Egypt Street, listening to the tick of his watch and waiting. Of all the seasons of the year, the rabbit most preferred winter, for the sun set early then, and the dining room windows became dark, and Edward could see his own reflection in the glass. And what a reflection it was. What an elegant figure he cut. Edward never ceased to be amazed at his own fineness. Let's leave him there, whereas my mother would have said he's cruising for a bruisin'. I had about a year ago a group of kids in Florida who wrote me about Edward Tulane and said that in the beginning he thinks he's all that and a bag of chips, and then he finds out that's not the case. So, okay, thank you for letting me read.
When I finally started writing, I started by writing for adults, short stories. And then what happened to me was I got a job at a book warehouse, and I was assigned to the 3rd floor. I was a picker, so I went around pulling the books off the shelves and filling the orders. And the 3rd floor was nothing but children's books. And I entered into that job with a bias that I think a lot of serious adult readers have, which is, oh, kids' books, it's all about duckies and bunnies. It's not, it's not a real book. But as a reader, there was only so long that I could go picking those books off the shelf without starting to read them. And so I read a novel by Christopher Paul Curtis called The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. And I remember exactly where I was in the warehouse when I started to read that book. And I thought, I didn't know that you could do this with a kid's book, that you could, it's so funny, it's so warm, and it also deals with really big things. And so that was kind of like the first inkling I had that I wanted to try something like that. And I actually took that book home and like typed up a chapter of it to see, okay, how long would a chapter be, and how long would a manuscript be, and then I started to write my first book because of Winn-Dixie.
So let's do some questions so I can get to talk with y'all. Who's going to ask the first question? Where do I get my ideas for my books? Do you know what eavesdropping is? It's not considered polite, but it is very, I like to stare at people, and I've learned how to do it without my mouth hanging open now, so it doesn't look like I'm doing it. And if you listen to people when they talk, and if you look at the world around you, I sometimes say, people will go, are you worried that you're going to run out of ideas? And I'm like, have you been on a city bus recently? If you get on a bus and listen to people and watch them, there's so many stories that are just waiting to be told. What inspired me to do Mercy Watson? So how many of y'all know Mercy Watson, the pig? Again, you're very well read. So I always have a notebook with me when I'm, no matter where I go, because again, with the eavesdropping, I might see something that I think is an idea and I'll put it in there. But also sometimes strange things will go through my head. So I was sitting on an airplane and all of a sudden a pig face popped into my head, and underneath it, the word mercy. So I got out the notebook and I wrote that down. And when I got home, I started writing, and I figured out that Mercy was a pig, that she lived with Mr. and Mrs. Watson, who were not pigs. And that seemed funny to me. And so I thought, okay, this has got legs, I can tell a story. But it was one of those things that I would pull it out and work on it, and it never quite came together. Are you still listening to this? Okay, good. So I got a new car. And it was my first brand new car of my life. And the first day that I had it, I took a friend to the airport, and she got into my car with a gigantic piece of toast. And it had a lot of butter on it. And she started to eat it in my brand new car, spraying greasy crumbs everywhere. And I said to her, can you wait until you get to the airport to eat your toast, because you're messing up my car? And it didn't stop her from eating the toast. Instead, what I got was a lecture about toast, how it should be buttered all the way to the edges, how it should have a great deal of butter on it, how it tasted better if somebody else had made it for you. And by the time I got rid of her, I knew what was missing in the book about the pig, which is what the pig loved, which is toast with a great deal of butter on it. Yeah, so that's where that came from. Let me get over on this side here. Why did I want to become an author? Well, I've always been a huge reader. I was a huge reader as a kid. I worked during college and after college, I worked at Walt Disney World, and I wore a blue polyester spacesuit. And I said to people, look down and watch your step here, watch your step, look down and watch your step 8 hours a day. And I thought, I wonder if there's something else that I can do with my life. But seriously, it was all that reading, and I majored in English. And when I really solidly got it into my head that I wanted to be a writer was when an English professor said to me in my senior year that I had a, quote, certain facility with words, end quote. That's what he said. I should consider graduate school. And I thought, I think he's trying to tell me I'm the next Flannery O'Connor. Why should I bother going to graduate school? So I just got a black turtleneck and told everybody that I was a writer. And so I managed to spend 10 years that way. But we'll talk about what happened next later on. What were my favorite books when I was a child? This is the fantastic thing about children's literature. Those books that I loved. How many of y'all have read Stuart Little? Mouse and the Motorcycle. All the Little House on the Prairie books. Island of the Blue Dolphins, The Borrowers. I really did live to read, and I loved a book called The 21 Balloons. Anybody read that? It was a Newbery, and I didn't necessarily have favorites. I just plowed through everything in the school library and everything in the public library. Everything except for, I kind of hit a snag after I read Black Beauty. How many of y'all have read Black Beauty? I was so traumatized by what happened to that horse that I was afraid of any book that had an animal on the cover. So I would look at the cover of Charlotte's Web and Wilbur's face on there, like every week in the library, and think, something terrible is going to happen to that pig. I'm not having anything to do with it. So I made it all the way through childhood without reading that book, and then I was taking a class in writing for young people, and the teacher said, you have no business writing for children unless you've read Charlotte's Web. And then she quoted the first line of the book. Anybody? Where is Papa going with that axe? And I thought, it's going to be even worse. I mean, we're like start off with the death of the pig, you know? So, but I reread that book every year now. That's got to be one of my favorite books. I love it. How many of y'all have read Charlotte's Web? How many of you have cried? How many of you have cried on the radio but reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, making a fool out of yourself? Yes. My favorite book that I wrote. Are you here with a parental unit? You're a sister. And so if we approached your mother, which one of you do you think she would pick as your favorite? Right? It's good that you said I don't know. But she would probably say something like this. I love them equally but differently. And that's the way it is for me with the books, is like I love them equally. I see them as deeply flawed but lovable anyway. I'm not saying that you're deeply flawed. I'm just saying I feel like my books are, but I love them anyway, and I love them as individuals. So I can't pick a favorite. What was the easiest book to write? Well, when I was writing Because of Winn-Dixie, which was the first one, I never in a million years thought that it would get published. So I thought I can do whatever I want to do. So that one, in retrospect, seems like it was a little bit easy. And then Edward Tulane just kind of wrote itself. And that has never happened before or since. But it was just like it just kind of like arrived and I just wrote it down. So those two, probably. So the question is, well, first it was, you gave me a compliment, which is the characters' names. I have strange names in the books. Where do those names come from? Everything about writing is hard for me, all of it, except for the names. And I don't know where they come from. They just pop into my head. It's another reason I always have that notebook with me. And I think that maybe I would venture to say that I grew up in the South and Central Florida. Part of it was being surrounded by strange names there. I woke up one morning and thought, am I making this up, or did we go to school with a boy named General Payne? So I called up my best friend and I said, is this just like, did this happen? Did we go to school with General Payne? And she said, yes, General and his brother Sergeant Payne. And it's just like, so I think that if you're around that, it kind of distorts your brain at an early age. And so I think that's part of it too. How did I get the idea for Louisiana's Way Home? So Louisiana Elefante was a character in the book that came before this, Raymie Nightingale. And I have had a lot of letters about how I should write books that continue on a character. Like when I wrote Winn-Dixie, one of the very first letters I got was from a kid in Illinois who wrote me like a 10-page letter outlining what was going to happen in Winn-Dixie 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then at the very end, this kid squeezed in, P.S., I have done all the hard work. Get busy. And it's just like, and I carried that letter from house to house, and I finally lost it. And then, so I get a lot of Winn-Dixie sequel requests. I get a lot of Despero sequel requests. Edward Tulane, it's like make the story go on, and I've never felt compelled to do that. But I finished Rainy Nightingale, and Louisiana, who is just an odd and wonderful character, would not go away. And her voice wouldn't go away. So I kept on writing the first line of this book in my notebook, and eventually it turned into a book. As I go through life and I see things, it's like, oh, do I think that this should go in this book, or do I like... What I do is, again, with that notebook that I always have with me, I keep a running list at the back of it of what I think of as story sparks, kind of. And each time I switch to a new notebook, I transfer those. And sometimes some of those things, just like you said, will get in a story that I did not anticipate at all. For a long time, I had the words Elf Ear, Nebraska written down. And I thought, oh, that'll be a novel unto itself. But it's not. It played out where it showed up in Louisiana's Way Home as a place that they never go to, but it was very central to what happened to her and her grandmother. So I say it blundermeesing, the correct pronunciation, but you can never talk. One, I had a 5th grade teacher named Mrs. Fennell who said any proper name, there's no correct pronunciation except for how the person says that they, I was, speaking of pronunciation, I was in line at the grocery store, this was like maybe 6 months ago, and this guy came up behind me and said, excuse me, and I thought like I was in his way, and so I moved, and he's like, no. There's an ongoing debate in my family about the police officer in the Mercy Watson books. Is it Officer Tomalello or Tomalilo? And I'm like, which way do you say it? And he said Tomalilo, and it's like, okay, I say Tomalello, and he's like, my wife is right. So it's just like, yeah. What inspired because of Winn-Dixie? So, like I said, Winn-Dixie was the first book. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't think I was going to get published. And I had recently moved from Florida to Minnesota. And it was a shock. There's just no way I just had no idea that it could get that cold. And I arrived without gloves or socks. I just didn't, so anyway, the whole thing was it was a little bit hard. I was homesick for Florida. It was my second winter there, and the high, and you guys can understand this, the high for 3 days in a row was 27 degrees below zero. And I would go out to the car and open it, and pieces of the car door would fall off because they were frozen. And so if you grew up in Central Florida and it's 27 degrees below zero, you kind of want to go back to Florida, right? And so I wrote that book because it let me go back home. It was also a time in my life where I didn't have a dog and I couldn't have one, and I was experiencing dog withdrawal. So like if there was a dog in the car next to me when I was driving, I would beep the horn and wave at the dog. And I got to make up the best dog that I could think of, which is Winn-Dixie. How many of y'all have dogs? That's so good. How many have cats? Yeah. Okay, so somebody's going to come up and tell me that they have a cat that's just as wonderful as a dog. I will pretend to believe you. How do I like the Winn-Dixie movie? I actually, I like it a lot. I got to work on the Winn-Dixie movie. I got to go to the set. I got to learn how to write a screenplay. It was all very exciting. But there's like, how many of y'all, when you read a book, see it kind of as a, yeah, and they say it's about 70% of us do. And so invariably when a movie comes out, we're usually disappointed because we've got our own movie in our head, right? And the person who's making the movie has got their movie in their head, So it never really matches up the way that you want it to, and I know that. But we still love movies based on books because it brings people to books, yeah. How did I get the idea for Bengali? So Bengali is written with a friend, Allison McGee. She's very tall. I'm very short. It's about a tall girl and a short girl. And if I had a visual aid, you could see that I bear a striking resemblance to Bink. And so it was just like two friends who are very different, one's tall, one's short, and how they get along and how they don't get along. It was very fun to do, because anytime I sit in a room and write, I think, I don't know what's going on in here. And if you sit in a room with somebody else, you think, that person will figure it out. It was nice. It was very comforting. How did I feel when my first book was published? I will tell you the truth, there is still a part of me that they cannot believe that it happened. And there is this story that when Candlewick, my publisher, called me, I was at work when they told me that they were going to take the book, and that what I said to them was, I can't talk, I have to take a bath. And so I don't know, I don't remember saying that, but the whole, I can't believe it. I do feel so lucky that I get to do it, and that I still get to do it. And it's been 18 years now, so it's just like, and it's thrilling. What is my favorite thing to do except write books? I have to say, at the risk of like angering some teachers of writing books is not my favorite thing to do. There's a great quote from Dorothy Parker: I hate writing, I love having written. Does that make any sense to you? So it's just like I wake up in the morning and it's the first thing I do before I can talk myself out of doing it. But it is, life makes more sense if I'm doing it, but it's also really hard for me. So what do I like to do that isn't writing? I like to eat. I have a lot of friends in my neighborhood who are wonderful cooks, and so usually I'm finished with my work day around 2 or 3, and I start to think, when are these people going to get home, and what are they going to be making for dinner? And that's my hobby, is eating their food. Wow. Are there any themes or messages that I try to communicate through my books? If I tried to do that, I would mess up. The very first time I went to do a school visit, I was super excited, because it was just like it was $200. It seemed a huge amount of money. You go and you visit a class and you talk about the book. So I'm standing up at the front of the room with the teacher, and the teacher says to the kids, all right, now what we're going to do is talk about the themes in this book. And I thought, oh no, I wonder what those are, and it's just like, and I could feel like sweat rolling down the side of my, and then this wonderful teacher, along with these wonderful kids, theme by theme, they wrote them up on the board. And I could see where they were true, and so when I got out to the car, I wrote down what they had written, and the next school visit, I went and said, okay, we're going to talk about the themes that are in this book. And then I used that list. But I didn't know that they were in there. And if I was trying to put them in there, I would have failed miserably. So the story is smarter than I am, and also the story is not complete until y'all read it. Until it becomes a conversation between me and the reader. Does that make sense? Do I think that I am going to write a book about Beverly? I have written a book about Beverly, and it will come out next year. Yeah. So, it was just like she was not going to be left behind with those other two. Do I hope that Louisiana's Way Home becomes a movie? I'm always thrilled when they become movies, but it's that thing where you can't control what happens. But I do love. It's kind of like having a kid. You let your story go off and have this life that is different from what you might have imagined. Because when you sell the rights to a movie, you have no control. You just say, yes, you can make the movie, or no, you can't. That's the only way you control it. And I always think, go make a movie. It would be great. What made me think of a litmus lozenge? What does it make me think of? You're tricky. Are you a teacher? Yeah, yeah. So, litmus lozenges from Because of Winn-Dixie, and you put it in your mouth and it makes you feel sad and happy at the same time. a little melancholy. Remember when Sweetie Pie spits it out because it tastes like not having a dog? No one has ever asked me that. I would like to thank you for stumping me in front of everybody. It tastes like not having a dog, and it tastes like having had a dog, and it tastes like sitting around with people that you love, and also not being able to sit around a table with people that you love. All of those things mixed up together, sweet and sad at the same time. Yeah. Can I comment on my revision process? I love talking about process because how many of y'all know about the Curlin collection at the University of Minnesota, which is not that far away for y'all? Okay, so, because a lot of times, like if you're in Florida and you say, how many of you are gonna go to Minnesota soon and look at the Curlin? So you can go in there and you can see it's children's books, artists and writers, and you can go in and you can check out the rough drafts of many, many books. And you can see how I wrote Despero, and you can see how I wrote Because of Winn-Dixie, and why I love that collection so much, even though it's very, very embarrassing, is that it shows how much work it is. And that it is not, we get it in our heads that it's this magic process, and that if you're supposed to do it, when you sit down to do it, it will come out right the first time. And there's this wonderful book called Art and Fear that talks about how there's one genius born every century, one Mozart who hears the music and puts it down, and then they say, guess what? That's not you. So if you want to write stories, make music, make art, you have to be willing for it to be really bad. So I start with the first draft. It's terrible. It's laughably bad. I let it sit. I come back to it. I do a second draft. I say, don't panic. This is only the second draft. I let it sit for 2 weeks. I come back. I do a third draft. I let it sit. I come back. I do a fourth draft. Around the fifth draft, I will let a few trusted friends read. And then I will go back and do a sixth draft and sometimes a seventh draft before it ends up in my editor's hands. Where's my editor? She's here today. Then what she does is sends me a letter that is sometimes, 10 pages, single-spaced, with editorial suggestions. So I get that letter, and I've learned now how it's like, so I get that letter, I read it, I always have the same response, which is, if you know so much, why don't you write a novel? And then the next day, after a day of walking around kicking things, being somewhat angry at her, I take the letter and I spread it out on the floor and I start to take notes. And what do you think? I do 90% of what you ask, and I get a better, richer, deeper book because of it, but I always go into it reluctantly. So that's yeah, Andrea Tampa. Yes. Yeah. I could not do it without her. Is there a book that I've written that I feel is unlike any other book that I've written? It's a wonderful question. No, I mean, I feel I go in, I'll go in different directions, in different genres sometimes, into magical realism or into fantasy a little bit, or just straight realistic fiction. But remember how I was talking about that first school visit and those themes that the teacher put up on the board? Forgiveness, friendship, family, those things seem to show up. I have a thematic concern that shows up from book to book. And Andrea and I were just talking this morning at breakfast about how I wish she could read something of mine without knowing it was mine and see if she would still like it. And she said, I think I would be able to tell that it was yours. And I think it's because I have those thematic concerns that keep on showing up again and again. Y'all have done a spectacular job. I'm so grateful for you for making the really impossible question, and for all the questions about process, and just for being here today. I think that stories matter so much, Books matter so much, particularly now. So thank you for believing in the power of story, and thank you for coming out on a snowy Saturday morning. So I'll sign up there, I think. Yes, thank you.
We need books for our souls. I will just go all out and say that. All of us, children and adults, and because books help us to see ourselves, they help us to see other people, and everything is so immediate now, and a book is a journey, and I'm a big proponent of reading aloud. And reading aloud with a group of people. And so when you can take that journey with a group of people, you bond in a way that is just, there must be some kind of science that says why it is. I don't know what the science is. I can just tell you it's true, that it changes everybody involved. We need it so much. So I think stories matter now more than ever.